Sound is an important element of multimedia. It can reinforce a message or a theme, it can set the mood, catch the interest of your audience, alert the audience, or provide explanation. There are three main types of sound used in multimedia projects: music, sound effects, and speech. Music, or the score, is generally a fairly lengthy sound element that must be planned and coordinated with the content to be most effective. Music is most often used as a background, particularly with unattended looping slideshows with no narration or dialogue, or in games where you're spending long periods of time moving from one area to another. Music is used to draw attention. Sudden changes in music may indicate a new character on the scene, a new danger appearing, etc. It cues a change of some sort. A signature lead can identify. Think about theme songs here. Most programs with episodic content will have a theme song that identifies them with advertisements as well as when users tune in. Music can set a mood. This is particularly obvious in movies, television shows, and gaming. This is probably less common for self-produced shows, as those people will have fewer resources to produce sophisticated soundtracks. Sound effects are often very short sound files and may consist of a wide variety of sounds, from digital beeps to animal and weather sounds. They're used to simulate reality. Think about clinking silverware and glasses in a set designed to look like a restaurant. They are used to create illusions. A Doppler effect creates the illusion of motion. Use of stereo channels can make you feel as though things are happening on either side of you or behind you. Or even performances where a cappella vocalists mimic other instruments or drums so well that you feel that they are actually accompanied by those instruments. Sound effects can set a mood. Footsteps, creaking doors, laughing children, thunder, crashing waves. All of these things set a mood, similar to the way that music sets a mood. It's just that the sounds themselves are short duration and they may be layered. Speech is the last type of sound commonly used. Speech can be narration, generally a single voice providing all the speech or large blocks of speech. Dialogue, multiple voices interacting with each other. And instruction or explanation. This is similar to narration, but focused on explanation or teaching rather than entertainment. Speech is often combined with music and sound effects, but be careful that the spoken tracks are never overwhelmed or obscured by the music and the soundtracks. This is a major problem with content produced by individuals with little training and less powerful tools for audio editing. While sound, music, or narration can be useful most of the time, they can be irritating as well. Use appropriate music to reflect the mood or the theme. Too much heavy, scary music can overwhelm or distract. A mismatch between the mood of the music and the emotion that the dialogue or scene is meant to evoke creates dissonance. Give the users the choice of turning off or on the sound. The experience of accidentally having some video blasting sound while you're trying to look at content on your cell phone in a meeting is extremely awkward. And having video playing loudly on your computer while you're frantically sorting through a lot of open tabs to find it and silence it is very irritating. Avoid irritating repetition. Think about a PowerPoint presentation with 100 bullets, each one of them going bing, bing, bing. Don't let your background music and your background noise overwhelm your dialogue. People who are growing a bit older or who are hearing impaired will often have difficulty separating the spoken dialogue from the background noise. Pay attention to commercially produced video and note how those producers handle dialogue over music. You may find that they make sure that the music is not actually playing while the dialogue is happening, but it happens before or after. In cases where the content of the page depends on sound or speech, consider providing a transcript as the alternative. People can generally read much faster than they can listen to narrative or dialogue, and they may prefer moving through the content much more quickly by scanning the transcript instead of listening to the audio and video files. You should consider the hearing impaired and the non-native speaker. Both of these groups of people may prefer to read the narrative to reduce misunderstanding. The rules to avoid annoying your listeners are: match the sound to its purpose, let the user control whether or not the sound plays, and let them control the volume. Avoid irritating repetition. Minimize the competition between levels on multiple tracks, especially between the narration and music in the background. And provide transcripts when needed. Reading is often faster, hearing impaired users need the text, and non-native speakers may prefer the text. What is sound? Sound is energy transmitted by means of vibrations of our eardrums and converted to nerve impulses that are interpreted in our brains. The vibrations enter the ear, travel down the ear canal, and move the eardrum. The movements of the eardrum pass the vibrations through the small bones of the ear and into the liquid-filled cochlea, the snail-shaped part of the diagram. Eventually, the sound waves are converted to nerve impulses that are recognized by the brain. Two major characteristics of sound are amplitude and frequency. Amplitude is the maximum displacement of the vibrating particles from their undisturbed positions. When you look at a waveform like the ones on the slide, the height of the wave is the amplitude. The further the distance from the baseline, which is silence, the greater the volume. Frequency is measured in cycles per second, commonly known as hertz. In other words, pitch. So when you look at the waveform, the closer together the waves, the faster or higher the frequency, and thus the higher the pitch. Volume is measured in decibels. Look at the diagram on the slide. What is the volume of a whisper? What is the volume of normal conversation? What is the volume where sound becomes painful? You will use decibels when you edit sound to determine what the top end of your volume will be. You want to produce soundtracks that are within safe ranges, but also ranges that can be turned up or down a bit more by the user. System sounds are useful because they give you feedback on computer activity. In Windows, you can select themes, which have a set of sounds as well as colors and screensavers that can individualize your operating system. Your cell phone also uses sounds, not only for calls, but for texts, alerts, and notifications. Some of these alerts are exceptionally loud. Amber alerts and flash flood alerts are two examples. Most of the time, you can individualize your system sounds. You can even download, purchase, or make your own. Computers have had built-in sound recorders for a long time. However, they're not usually very sophisticated. If you want tools that provide more features, you will need to acquire those and install them on your system. There are many apps for recording on cell phones. Some of these will have many more features than the basic app packaged with your device. We will use Audacity, a free open-source sound editor, for our sound project this week. Some of these programs will require additional equipment, such as external microphones or additional speakers. There are two different types of audio in the multimedia sphere: MIDI audio and digital audio. MIDI stands for Musical Instruments Digital Interface. We will look at that type first. MIDI was developed in the 1980s as a standard communications protocol between electronic musical instruments and the computer. When computers burst upon the scene, MIDI controllers soon followed. A MIDI file is not a digitized sound. It's the shorthand representation of music stored in a binary form. A MIDI file contains instructional data, notes, sequences of notes, which instruments to play, etc. This instructional data tells other devices how to generate an appropriate sound. It does not have the actual audio data, just the instruction to the instrument or the sound card on how to reproduce it. A MIDI controller usually has a keyboard and sliders to manage volume, programmable buttons to add additional sounds, and the like. You can create an entire orchestra score with different instruments and percussion tracks if you have the skills and the software to do it. But a MIDI file won't play on your computer as a standalone file like an MP3 file. MIDI audio does have some benefits. First, an individual musician can record music in his home or studio. He or she can basically produce all the tracks, all the parts, and even all the instruments. MIDI files are much smaller than other digital audio files, so they can be easier to distribute. You aren't sampling the sound, you're creating a container that holds all the instructions for reproducing the sound. There are a large number of instrument profiles available, so you can use MIDI to replicate the sound for a huge number of instruments. MIDI files do have some drawbacks. First is inconsistency in playback quality. MIDI devices are not identical, and the instruction set produced is very particular to the setup that produced it. MIDI files played back on a computer speaker, for example, can sound like really terrible electronic music. The other drawback is that MIDI files are not suitable for spoken dialogue or many side effects. If you want to produce MIDI files, you will need some musical talent or hired MIDI artists, MIDI instruments like electronic keyboards or other instruments, a MIDI sequencer software that allows you to record, edit, and save music generated by those MIDI instruments, and computer sound hardware or synthesizer to reproduce the sound once it's complete. This is an example of MIDI production software. Most people prefer an actual keyboard, not a visual representation of one that you would click with a mouse. The synthesizer is the hardware you need to translate the information generated by the MIDI devices into sound or music. It can also be used to play back the MIDI file as you are working on it. Synthesizers can be built into the soundboard on your computer, but serious musicians purchase an external synthesizer that may include a keyboard, pointing device, and selection of controllers and sliders. The synthesizer puts together parts and elements of a sound: instrument, notes, timbre, all the components that form a whole sound, which can be saved as a file. If you start with a file, the synthesizer will read it to generate signal, process the signal through electronic methods, and emerge with a unique sound that often cannot be duplicated by any other instrument. Before we talk about digital audio, we should probably revisit analog audio. Analog sound is not machine readable. It can be enjoyed live or it can be recorded. Analog recordings include vinyl records, LP, 33 RPM, and 45 RPM, as well as tape, reels, 8-tracks, and cassettes. Digital audio is a representation of an original sound, so it's analog audio captured and converted to a machine-readable format. You will need software, recording equipment, and a speakers or headphone to work with digital sound. Digital audio has a number of different codecs, which produce various file types. Some are more compressed than others, so you can minimize the file size. Digital audio is less affected by hardware, so you can get more consistent playback quality, whether you're playing it on a cell phone, a computer, a television, or through a custom stereo system. Most people are not audiophiles and are happy enough to listen to their favorite music on cell phones with earbuds. Others, of course, will invest in superior sound systems for homes and cars and purchase better quality headphones to improve the listening experience. Audio tracks for multimedia content will not degrade no matter how many times you copy or distribute them. With analog music, one separate instrument produces one soundtrack. To get an orchestral score, you must have a whole orchestra of musicians. With digital audio, one composer can play all the parts, laying down separate tracks as needed, adjusting the volume of each throughout the performance, and then exporting the entirety of the work on a single MP3 file ready for the appreciative listener. You saw how sound waves worked at the beginning of the presentation. To take an analog sound wave and turn it into digital sound, we digitize it. Sound digitization is accomplished by sampling and quantization. Digital sound is called sampled sound. If you want to look at the images on the slide, you can see that to sample the sound, you would capture the characteristics of the sound several thousand times per second. Where the wave crosses the sample point, which is the tiny blue squares, information is captured. What's the volume, what's the pitch, and what are the other characteristics of the sound at that particular point in time? This information is all stored in the file. I think of it as a series of snapshots. Quantization is the process of increasing the precision or the quality of the sound by dealing with the gaps between each sample. It attempts to fill in the space between each sample so that you experience better sound when the file is played back. So to sample a file every nth fraction of a second, a sample of the original sound is captured and stored in a digital format, a binary digit in bits and bytes. The sampling rate describes how often the samples are taken. The more samples, the better quality sound, and it also makes the file size bigger. The sampling size describes the amount of information that's stored for each sample in bits and bytes. Most of the time, people sample at 8-bit or 16 bits. Obviously, a 16-bit sample size retains more data than an 8-bit sample size. Audio is digitally sampled thousands of times per second. CD quality audio is sampled 44,100 times per second. Thus, the sampling rate is 44.1 kilohertz. Other sampling rates commonly used in multimedia are 22.05 kilohertz and 11.025 kilohertz. Less sample and less data means less quality. When you're recording, you need to pay attention to your volume. If you're using an equalizer, you may see red or yellow bars that indicate that your sound is reaching or exceeding the maximum range available. If you're using an editor and the amplitude is greater than the dynamic range available, clipping of the top and bottom of the wave occurs. This clipping is what happens when your waveform exceeds the capacity of your amplifier in either direction. If you see this, you need to adjust your microphone recording settings or reduce the volume. A little bit of clipping may not be noticeable, but you do want to minimize it. Some people describe the distortion that results as crackling or a metallic sound. In your audio editor, you can make adjustments to reduce clipping before you save the file. Clipping can happen when you're creating the file or when you're playing the file. Driving your speakers past their capacity can damage them. When you're creating audio files, you have to think about how to balance file size and quality. Ask yourself these questions. First, how accurate do you need the sound to be? More faithful reproductions, a characteristic called fidelity, require more data, higher sampling rates, and bit depth. Not all applications are created equal. You probably need a much more accurate sound for a movie soundtrack played in a Dolby-equipped theater environment than when jogging with earbuds and a cell phone. How much storage space is available is the second question. Typically, people who put music or podcasts on mobile devices have a space problem. In order to get more music in a limited space, choose file size over quality. If the space is not a limiting factor, you can make different decisions. Example, Blu-ray DVDs. They have a lot of space and are intended for a single movie and related product. Maybe your storage space is limited as to how many bookcases you have in your living room. Here is another set of questions to ask. How do you plan to distribute the files to your listeners? Usually this means either streaming or download. Streaming services don't have to worry so much about storage space, but they do have to worry about bandwidth. Listeners don't want their music interrupted for the file to buffer, so the files are compressed in order to put less load on the networks that carry the signal between the host and the users. Last, do you need stereo? Most music does need stereo. It sounds better when you're hearing it with both ears, and the sound can move back and forth between the left and the right channels. It makes the sound more like real life, and it gives the illusion of hearing it all around you, or at least from side to side. Stereo files require twice as much space as mono files. Monaural files use only one channel, and when you listen, it seems like all the sound is coming from directly in front of you. You may have multiple speakers playing monaural files or two earbuds, but the same signal is played on each of them. There are a lot of situations where monaural files are perfectly acceptable. With images and sound files, we talk about lossy and lossless formats. Lossy formats mean that when you compress them to make the file size smaller, some of the original data is jettisoned from the resulting file. You can't really uncompress it. A lossless format can be converted without losing any data. There are several types of sound files, and if you're editing a file, you want a lossless format. After you're finished with it, you may choose to export it in one of the lossy formats. You still have your original, so you won't lose anything. Both WAV and AIFF are lossless audio container formats based on PCM, which is with some minor changes to data storage. PCM audio for most people comes in these formats, WAV or AIFF, depending on whether you use Windows or OS X, which is a Mac operating system. They can be converted to and from each other without any degradation of quality. They are both considered lossless or uncompressed, and a stereo 2-channel PCM audio file sampled at 44.1 kilohertz or 44,100 times per second at 16 bits CD quality amounts to roughly 10 megabytes per minute. If you're recording at home for the purposes of mixing, this is probably what you want to use. This is considered a full quality file. The free lossless audio codec, Apple lossless audio codec, and Monkeys audio are all formats which compress audio much in the same fashion that anything is compressed in the digital world, using an algorithm. The difference between the zip files and the FLAC files is that FLAC is designed specifically for audio and has better compression rates without any loss of data. Typically, you're seeing about half the size of a WAV file. That is, a FLAC file for stereo audio at CD quality will run roughly 5 megabits per second. The upside is that if you want to do audio manipulation, you can convert back to a wave without any loss of quality. If you're an audiophile and you just listen to a lot of music with dynamic ranges, these formats are for you. If you've got a great set of speakers, cans, or earbuds, these formats will bring out the tones to showcase them. Most of the formats you see in day-to-day use are lossy. Some degree of audio quality was sacrificed in exchange for a significant reduction in file size. An average CD quality MP3 requires only 1 megabit per minute. Here are some of the more common lossy formats in use today. MP3. MPEG-1 Audio Layer 3 is the most common lossy audio codec in use today. Despite a considerable number of patent issues, it's still incredibly popular. Who doesn't have MP3 files laying around? Vorbis is a free and open source lossy format used more often in PC games. Free and open source software fans, such as many Linux users, often use this format. AAC is Advanced Audio Coding, a standardized format now used with MPEG-4 video. It's heavily supported because of its compatibility with digital rights management, its improvements over MP3, and because no license is needed in order to stream or distribute the content in this format. Apple fans probably have many files in AAC. WMA is Windows Media Audio, Microsoft's lossy audio format. It was developed and used to avoid licensing issues with the MP3 format, but because of major improvements and the DRM compatibility, as well as a lossless implementation, it's still around. It was really popular before iTunes became the champion of DRM'd music. Lossy formats are what you use for all the music that you listen to and store. They're designed to be economical with hard drive space. Which format you choose depends on which digital audio player you use, how much space you have, and how much of an audiophile you are. Nowadays, computers will play almost anything, and most audio players will do multiple lossy formats. More and more do FLAC and APE. Apple sticks to MP3, ALAC, and AAC. You will see some of these options in Audacity as you start your sound project. A great deal of audio content can now be found online. Sound can be played over the web in one of two ways. Download and save the files to your computer first, then play the file. Or streaming. Sound is played while it's downloaded from the internet into the computer buffer, portion by portion. Streaming quality is very sensitive to connection speed and competing internet traffic. Some of the more popular providers of streaming music are pictured in the image on this slide: Spotify, Pandora, SoundCloud, Tidal, Apple Music, and more. These companies come and go, so various providers continue to change. You will need to secure the rights for all material that you use in your projects. This is even more important when you move from being a student to a content producer in your own right. If you don't feel that you can create your own music, and most of us can't, you may want to look for royalty-free music or Creative Commons licensed music. Royalty-free music is not the same as free music. You usually have to purchase royalty-free music, but then you can perform or play it as many times as you like. Here are some sites that offer music published under the Creative Commons licenses: CC Mixter, Free Music Audio Archive, Jamendo, Magnatune, Samuz, BeatPick, Cache Music, Section Z, OpSound, PodSafe Audio, Audio Farm, and the Internet Archive's NetLabels collection. As we finish this lecture, I want to leave you with some tips. You may or may not need sound depending on what kind of multimedia project you're working on. But if you are working on something that uses sound, spend some time thinking about what you want to use and how you want to use it while you're still in the planning stage. What kind of sound will you need? Narration, musical score, sound effects. When and where in the project will you use audio? Do you need it all the way through, beginning and end, attached to certain segments? Knowing how much audio you need and how you intend to use it will help you define some parameters for locating and editing the sound to suit. Decide whether or not you want to use MIDI or digital. As we said earlier, it's unlikely that you will need MIDI unless you're working with a score. Acquire the source material. This is usually the hardest part. There are a few sources for copyright-free music online, but not very many. If you can create your own music, that's great, but remember that everything is copyrighted. The music, the lyrics, the arrangement. If you're creating multimedia for commercial use, you will need to spend some time acquiring any content that you intend to incorporate into your final product. Edit the audio to suit your project. If your project is a blog or a podcast, you will mostly be recording yourself. Most people get set up with a small, simple set of equipment and software that serves as their studio. They need a computer, a microphone, and software. If they're doing a vlog, then a video camera. Once you get going, you can follow the same process every time. Edit your project as necessary, remove silence, noise, splash your tracks, and convert it to the correct file format. Always test your sound. It's surprising to me how many people do not spend time checking their recording levels, microphone settings, and the like. Make some test recordings and play them back to test the quality of the finished file. You really need to do these things before you launch into your recording session. If you have problems, you may be tempted to just distribute a poor quality file or waste a lot of time starting over. Make sure you write down your basic settings. If you have to record in multiple sessions, you'll want all the resulting files to sound the same, not some louder than others.